So the first one that I thought I'd talk about was someone asked what the greatest danger to marriage is. That's a tough one to put into kind of like the same thing when someone asks what's the best advice you could ever give. You know, giving you one thing or the top thing is always tough. But just a few thoughts that I'd have, and these come from a combination of probably my experience as a marriage therapist, from certainly doctrinal teachings that we receive in the church, and professional things, research and studies and what we find there. So most of them I would say are principles that are what wrap up kind of the biggest dangers. One of those being selfishness. We have a talk a number of years ago, I believe it was President Benson, who talked about selfishness being the center of all problems, or most problems in marriage, or the biggest risk for divorce. That's one of the things that he had pointed out. Maybe another way to look at selfishness is individualism. We're in a society that's moving towards more and more individual rights, individual um, rights to happiness and doing those things. And there's some good that comes from that. I'm not saying all those concepts are bad, but certainly when you get into marriage, there's a lot of sacrifice and compromise and leaning towards selfishness or meeting our own needs, especially at the expense of someone else or with a disregard for how it affects the other person. It is a significant, maybe one of, if not the most significant risk to marriage, just in general. And I would say increasingly so in a society that promotes that type of selfish or individualism. Another one would be a lack of forgiveness and being able to work through problems. And that probably even dovetails with another one I wrote down for my notes here was just an overall pessimism towards marriage and maybe acceptance of divorce. And so you match those up if someone's, struggles to forgive and to work through problems, or even just in a society where I think sometimes we have a hard time doing hard things and working through the struggles of marriage. Marriage is difficult. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And we struggle with that. We struggle with forgiveness and match that up with overall just kind of a pessimism towards marriage, particularly when we talk about divorce rates. A lot of times, I'm sure for most of you, if someone asked what the rate of divorce is, at least here in the United States, most would say about 50%. And that is the most common stat that's talked about with divorce rates. It's not an accurate stat. In fact, it's never been a stat that has been based off of what's happening in divorce, more about a projection in divorce. It's also a stat that's kind of a combined number of factors, um, that make it seem more bleak than maybe it is for most people. So, for example, and I think I may have mentioned this in an announcement or will later on. I know I often talk about this one somewhere in an announcement throughout the semester. But if you look at divorce rates, if you are college educated, for example, that reduces your divorce rate. As far as just the prediction, again, when we talk about divorce rate, we're estimating what the chances are that you would be divorced, such as a 1 in 2 chance or a 1 out of 4 chance. And so we look at when you're college educated, that typically reduces that risk of divorce. Sometimes much lower, depending on other factors as well. Your divorce rate for your situation, based off of your various factors, might be as low as in the teens or 20%. But we kind of make it sound like everyone has a 50% chance that they'll get divorced when they enter marriage. So when you have kind of that pessimism and things get tough and we struggle with forgiveness, we struggle doing hard things, then it's easy to kind of go quickly towards divorce. And please know that I'm not saying that everyone that's been divorced has jumped quickly to divorce. In fact, I know some students who have shared this semester about years or decades of marriage that ended in divorce. And so I know there's plenty of stories and individuals who have struggled and worked on it. And there are some situations where maybe even quick action towards divorce is the right decision. So again, I'm trying to speak generally, not specific to every person's unique circumstances. And then the last, but back to this question of the greatest danger to marriage, certainly I think, and this one's probably biased towards my experience as a marriage therapist who specializes in working with couples, in working in couples that have dealt with infidelity, including pornography issues, other sexual addictions. So it probably is biased towards what I see and what I see more often. But that and other things that I've seen out there would lead me to say that maybe the best way to generalize it would be disobedience to the law of chastity. And I mean that in two ways. One, certainly, when we look at infidelity and we look at pornography, sexual addictions, those would certainly be under that category. And I would also say obedience to the law of chastity is learning to have healthy sexual intimacy in your marriage. So it's not about just what you don't do, but the good things that you do and being able to appreciate and embrace and enjoy intimacy. And I think in both ways we risk that in our society. Plenty of time of problems with infidelity and immorality in our society today. And I think difficulty of developing healthy sexual relationships, whether that be because we don't talk enough about it, or when we talk about it, we talk about it in a way that makes people anxious about sexual intimacy. And we'll be talking about that with another question here, or any number of other reasons that we struggle there. So I'd say, as far as behavioral things that are the greatest danger, not being able to have a good sexual relationship and avoid those things that are against the laws of chastity. And I know, I think it was President Kimball who had said that in their look at divorces amongst church members, he believes one of, if not the top reason for divorce, is problems centered around sexual intimacy. Um, and so again, that's another one that I've seen in my practice, and I've seen church comments, and there's plenty of studies of things that damage marriage that way too. Next one question that I thought I would address is how to, and I apologize, this is one of those ones that definitely would have been good to answer back when it was asked, because it was about the stay-at-home orders, which I know are being lifted, and it was how to strengthen a long-distance relationship during that stay-at-home order situation. And so I still included it as one of the ones I wanted to talk about, partly because people are still under different levels of stay-at-home order in different states and countries. I know some of the civil unrest that we've experienced has added to some of that. Hopefully not the long term that we've had in the pandemic here, but some stress there that's similar. And looking forward, we also unfortunately don't know what's going to happen in coming months. Today was just announced about, for example, conference in October, that they're still going to do it remotely and not have people gather. And so we know that there's concern about in the fall and what's going to happen in the winter if we don't have good medical interventions. Will things spike? So this may be a really relevant question for some down the road as well. So some of my thoughts there. One of them is get to know each other. Take that time to build your friendship. If you haven't studied John Gottman's information, I would encourage it just in general, and I'll talk more about that in an announcement in a couple weeks. But Dr. Gottman has done a lot of research on marriage and what makes it successful. And one of the main things that he finds is a quality friendship. And what I love about his research, and I'm not going to go into that in detail here, is that he doesn't just say be good friends. He really digs into what does that look like and gives some hands-on applicable ways to do that. One of those being what he calls having a good love map, meaning you know your partner's inner world, their likes, their dislikes, their hopes, their dreams, and all those things that really help you be a good friend and be able to be there for each other and care about each other. Well, it's a great time to build that. Find Gottman has and other people have lots of lists of questions to ask your spouse or your partner, or your boyfriend, girlfriend. I would encourage you to use that time to build that friendship and have conversations, talk about those things. I would also encourage during the times of pandemic, of civil unrest, that we also be patient with each other, to realize that there's going to be additional stress and anxiety, depression, things like that that'll go on for anyone, even people that typically don't struggle much with anxiety or depression, have experienced that and will experience that in these kind of situations. And so an added dose of patience and realizing that sometimes some of the difficulties we might experience in our relationships aren't because of what's going between us. That might be where it plays out, but it's about what's going on outside the home and in the world. Um, and so having that kind of patience and almost what we call a we against the problem attitude, like it's us against the challenges that we're facing, and in this case maybe the pandemic, the world unrest, those kinds of things, versus us against each other. And sometimes we let problems that we can be united against start to divide us. And so just a reminder of that, I think, is an important thing too, as things can be stressful and relationships can, as we've seen, struggle in this time. And then, generally, I would say any time that's really unique and stressful and difficult that would discourage making any major decisions in one way or the other. And I hesitate. I'm not saying that anyone's made a decision to get married or change marriage dates or to break up, made the wrong decision. But typically, it's tough to make good thought out decisions when we're under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress. Um, so I would certainly say that for those who are married, and maybe this question, they're also thinking of how could we strengthen our marriage relationship, not just a long distance dating relationship, but our marriage relationship during these kind of circumstances. That would definitely be my advice. In fact, I'll probably, with this announcement when I post it, post a handout from Dr. Bill Doherty that he posted a number of weeks ago about to therapists about how to help couples during this pandemic and the stay-at-home orders, and it has a few of these similar to what I've talked about, some of them, and a couple other pieces of advice. And that's one of the things he says for couples who are struggling, married couples that are considering divorce. He would encourage them to kind of put some of those problems on hold and not make major decisions about their marriage during these times. Okay, next question I wanted to talk about. And again, I thought this was an incredibly important and a good question. And it was about sexual intimacy, and we'll talk about that near the end of the semester, but wanted to talk about that here, particularly in case there's a more of a pressing timeline for different individuals approaching marriage in the class. But it was about the idea of if prior to marriage, even during engagement, you feel really uncomfortable about the idea or the thought of being sexually active and intimate with your spouse, if that makes you very uncomfortable while you're dating and engaged, will that go away when you get married? That's a great question. And I can't say definitively a yes or a no, because I do think there are some situations where maybe some of that discomfort comes from an appropriate caution about wanting to follow with your values and the law of chastity. And so, in some sense, some of that I do believe can resolve. But my experience, and again, it's biased towards talking to couples that are coming into therapy. And so maybe if I had a chance to interview healthy couples a lot more often, I'd find maybe more who experienced discomfort before and then felt comfortable with the idea of being intimate after marriage. But my experience with my couples and what I've seen is that that does not typically resolve with becoming married. And I've heard way too many stories of quite the opposite, that they really expected, assumed, and hoped that once they got married, it's like a light switch that turns and automatically we're comfortable and it's okay, and we'll view sex differently than we had been viewing it before because now it's acceptable and approved and encouraged within marriage. And that doesn't happen. They typically still feel just as uncomfortable, and it can easily snowball really quickly if, let's say, even on the honeymoon, I've had a lot of couples that have had really tough honeymoon experiences because of that or other reasons, that it doesn't go very well. And then very quickly, a situation in marriage where we're not very good, um, dealing with discomfort, dealing with struggles and problems, because if you're uncomfortable with the idea of being intimate, then you're probably uncomfortable talking about sexual intimacy. And and I found that even married couples are uncomfortable talking about sexual intimacy. They may have been married for decades and have a hard time saying the word sex or talking about specific body parts. And it's just it's one of those areas that we struggle with, and not just in the church. I've seen articles and research talk about this with just individuals in general and all marriages. So, so I would say that that probably wouldn't go away, and so it's an important one to focus on prior to marriage. And when I say focus on, a lot of it might be getting, at the very least, some good education with good resources, good books. I'll mention a few here that I would recommend. Talking to a trusted person who might feel comfortable talking to you about sex and marriage, who's had a healthy sexual relationship in marriage and can talk openly about that. Hopefully you won't have the experience that I heard from one research study where they were interviewing college students down in Utah County and asking about their sexual education prior to marriage. One of their participants said that she asked her mom as she was approaching her wedding day. She said, "Mom, I haven't really ever learned much about sex and how to have a good sexual relationship. I'm a little worried about that. What can you tell me?" And her mom's response was, "Adam and Eve figured it out, so will you." And that's where she left it. The researchers said as they talked to this participant about what happened moving forward, good news is she had some older siblings, including a sister she felt comfortable talking to. So instead of just taking her mom's advice and saying, well, I guess I can't learn or read or be educated, she turned to her sister, asked her sister, and her sister gave her a lot better information and advice and prepared her well for marriage. So talking to someone that you could trust that would be comfortable talking about that would be important, and potentially even some counseling. And when I say counseling, we often think of counseling when you're really struggling, when you're having problems. Boy, I wish we could do way more premarital counseling, just for all couples. I would love to be able to see that happen a lot more often. And so it's just not just something we do when things are falling apart, but how do we prepare for marriage? How do we strengthen good marriages? And this would be one of those topics. Preparing for marriage and sexual intimacy from a trusted source would be another good thing. Some of the books I might recommend if you do want to look at some of these things, um, a lot of these, there are a number of them that are probably more towards after marriage when you dive into those and working with at that point spouse on them. But they address these topics and I think are good for preparing for marriage and a lot of them working as a couple after marriage. One of them is by a therapist who's a member of the church, Laura Brotherson. She has a book called And They Were Not Ashamed, and it deals primarily with talking towards women about in the church about discomfort about sex, as if sex is always bad and dirty. So I would encourage that one for sure. Another one is written by someone outside the church, but it's from a Christian view. LaHaye and LaHaye are their last names, called The Act of Marriage. And it talks about marriage in there and talks about biology and appropriateness of sexual intimacy. Another good one just overall on just intimacy and seeing it as something that comes from Heavenly Father's plan, and that's a good thing. Elder Holland gave an iconic talk called Of Souls, Symbols, and Sacraments that I would encourage you to read. And then a couple other books on the topic. Another group of LDS or church member authors, Busby, Carroll, and Levitt, wrote a book called Sexual Wholeness in Marriage that is fantastic. And finally, Dr. Anthony Hughes, What Your Parents Didn't Tell You About Sex. That one I would say is particularly geared towards married couples and has a lot of kind of ideas and discussions to have and ways to practice with a spouse to improve your sexual relationship. So that one definitely is more of a post-marriage kind of resource for you. But above all, I would say one of the most important things is to be able to learn to talk comfortably about sex and to talk with your partner and spouse about sex, including, I know it's obviously a little difficult premaritally and talking about that in a way that doesn't trigger feelings and maybe get you into trouble. I remember when I was in school in a marriage prep class, a number of years ago, where they suggested that you read a book. I think it was The Act of Marriage is the one that they were recommending at the time, and talked about that you read it and you talk about it, but you talk about it in a semi-public place, like at the university library in a corner where there's not as many people, and then you separate for 24 hours before you come back in case it triggers some of those good feelings of attraction and desire. So again, I say that more somewhat in a humorous way, but I do think that there's some good truth of making sure that you talk about preparing for intimacy with your fiance, especially when you're at that point. But obviously using good caution of what you talk about and how you talk about that. Um, but it shouldn't be something where you can't have those discussions. You can't say the word sex. You can't talk about the fact, almost pretending like you're not going to be sexually intimate and one day, and then literally get married and the next day be able to expect to just magically have a great sexual relationship. And even those that talk, would say even in marriage, it takes a while to improve that and work on it. So no one should expect to have this magically wonderful, romantic Hollywood experience right after they get married. So, or any time in marriage that it's going to be like what they portray in Hollywood, uh, for that matter. But I do think one of the biggest issues in marriage as well, when it comes to sexual intimacy, is a lack of comfort and willingness to talk openly with your spouse about sex. about what you appreciate, what you don't appreciate, what you enjoy, don't enjoy, and have those conversations. Dr. Gottman, the one I'd referenced earlier, talks about that. His quote that he says, paraphrasing it, is that often when it comes to sexual intimacy, we try to be very vague, very brief, and have when we have those conversations and hope that those brief, vague conversations will turn into positive, specific results, and it doesn't happen. And so most couples need to work on having those conversations better. Well, I know I only got to 3 questions. I actually planned 3 others, but for the lack of the length of this video, at least, I'll pause here and then I'll do another video with these questions. And there were a few more that I know I didn't even plan to get to today that I'll try and answer throughout the semester. So I hope those are helpful. Um, Please feel free to keep adding questions on there. I will try to do better at getting on there, pulling off some of those questions and answering them, whether they'll be through more video announcements or posting an announcement, a written announcement, or even posting it as a discussion for everyone in the class to be able to participate in as well. So I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe, and I hope you're enjoying the class. Thank you.